Greetings, good day, wherever you're coming from. My name is Chuck Gillespie. I am the CEO of the National Wellness Institute, and this is our Reimagining Wellness Live conversation. I'm very excited to have Jim Harter from Gallup as our guest today. Jim, tell us a little bit about your background. Obviously, pretty much your entire career has been with Gallup, correct?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Chuck, and great to meet everybody. Look forward to the discussion today. Yeah, I'm on year 30, what is it now? Since 85, 30, 37 or so at Gallup. And yeah, it's been most of my career. I started off actually as an intern, my undergraduate work, and I knew what I was pretty good at, but I didn't really see this career coming. It just I got kind of lucky in that that internship turned into something I was very interested in. I got a lot of great mentors along the way, and just learned a lot while I was going through grad school. And so it's probably the best way to learn was to be applying the work while you're learning it. And yeah, so just kind of built my career in it. One of the nice things about being in a company for a long time, and I think young people need to be reminded of this, is that you can really figure out what you do best and adjust your work and have partners that do things that you're not quite as good at, and make that evolution work over time, so that you can improve not only your engagement at work but also your overall well-being. A lot of people don't know Gallup has had flex time since 1969, so it's kind of been a part of our culture for as long as I've been there, since 85. That's transition during COVID to more remote work and everything was a pretty seamless one for us. Not everybody, but it was for us. And most of the people I've worked with for quite a while, and so we had already built trust and how to do handoffs and all that sort of thing. So I said, thank God for technology. When all this happened, it really saved us.
Absolutely. So, Jim, talk to me a little bit about how Gallup kind of got into well-being. Obviously, the book that you and Tom Rath did is kind of my starting point with you and Gallup. Kind of talk about how Gallup kind of got into this well-being space.
Yeah, it actually started with our founder, George Gallup. He'd done a number of global studies asking people about their lives. And our company goes back to 1935. And he did kind of an interesting study. We wrote about it in our recent book, Wellbeing at Work, and try to summarize a lot of his findings, because they seem to be so timeless in terms of how they relate to modern day academic literature and what we've been finding overall. But he studied, they called them the oldsters, people who lived to be 95 plus, and looked at what they had in common, and, found a lot of similarities to things we know now, like they loved their jobs, they had fun doing their work, they tended to eat smaller meals, and they had jobs that required them to move around a lot. They weren't, in any particular job type. They were kind of spread out across different job types, different, some rural, some suburban and urban, and but they had great social lives in terms of their, the people around them, a lot of social support. Like I mentioned, their physical well-being was good, in that they moved around a lot. And anyway, some of those early insights I thought were I always kind of like to go back to the past to see what's been done before we do our work. But then Jim Clifton, our CEO, asked Gail Mueller, who is heading up our global research, because we've been doing a number of polls all over the world, but he asked if we could do a true world poll. No, it had never been done before. And Gail said, I don't see why not. So we took that on. I got to be a part of that team and help develop the questionnaire and the research behind it. But one of our goals in studying well-being was to arm leaders with insights about how if they know what the citizens are thinking, they can make better decisions. It doesn't mean they're going to do everything that a poll says that people want, but it informs decisions, and it can tell leaders what's likely to happen into the future. John Clifton just wrote a book called Blind Spot that gets really deep into our global trends and how there has been a blind spot in terms of leadership being informed on the well-being of citizens and how that affects decisions they make into the future. So we think it's important information for leaders. We think it's important information for individuals to manage and take ownership of their own life and to gain insights from the latest research on what works. Sometimes what we think works from a well-being standpoint isn't really what does. You ask people open-ended, what leads to the best life imaginable, and the top two things they'll mention are health and wealth, almost invariably across the world. Those are both important and can be important if they're managed correctly. But we found underneath that, if you dig deeper and really study what relates to a good life and people having good days, we found 5 elements that really contribute to that. And the most foundational one was career. It takes up so much of our time, and it's whether people are working in a full or part-time job, or maybe working from the home, or retired, whatever life stage they're in. They haven't got an occupation; they've got something they do. It's usually the first question we ask people when we meet them is, "What do you do?" And that takes up such a large amount of our time that is so foundational. Social well-being is also very, very foundational to the other elements. The other 3, real quickly, are financial well-being. That's how we manage our life our financial life to reduce stress and increase security. And our physical well-being, of course, that's whether we manage our physical life so that we have a lot of energy during the day to get done what we want to get done. And community well-being is really how we connect to the communities that we live in and become a part of some of the solutions in those communities, and give back is at the highest level of well-being. So that's kind of a quick history of where we're at today. We've been thinking a lot about how well-being works in organizations effectively, and how important it is to building a thriving culture overall that builds resilience when we go through tough times like we've had recently, and even in good times to excel.
And Jim, I love the fact that you brought up the 5 dimensions of well-being. Obviously, National Wellness Institute started, in 1976 with Bill Hitler's 6 dimensions of wellness or well-being, and they're not that much far off from what you did with the Gallup work. And it's one of the comments that I get a lot. I'm sure you probably do too. It's like, well, why don't you have this dimension or that dimension or this dimension?
Mm-hmm.
And I know, having read a lot of the work that you've done and a lot of the work Gallup has done in general, you say a lot of the same things we do. It's in there. It's just not one of the key elements. But what we really start to talk about then is not necessarily which dimensions we're talking about, but how we take a multi-dimensional approach to life, to work, to friendships, connectivity, and so forth. Talk about how you sometimes answer that same question.
Yeah, they are the dimensions they are independent, but they're also interdependent. And when you think about well-being solutions, usually that interdependency is the key. The one dimension that gets brought up the most that people say, they look at the 5 and they say this one's missing, it'd be mental health, or emotional health, sometimes people call it. And to your point, it's in there. And those 5 are really predictors of having good mental health overall. I mean, if you look at each of those dimensions, on the high end, there's a thriving state on the high end of each of the 5 elements. On the low end, there's a suffering state. And so for career, that'd be being actively disengaged in your work, where you just hate your job, or hate what you do every day. That'd be the suffering state there. On social, it'd be loneliness. And we're seeing loneliness right now is higher for young people. But it can be resolved partially through work, through friendships at work. And we got to think seriously about that as people are in more remote settings now than ever before, and how that's dropped a little bit. But it's also even more important now than it's ever been before. And social, so that's an example of where social and career are intersected, right? A suffering state in physical is having so much physical pain that you can't you can't deal with it. You can't even think straight. And if that's the case, that becomes your first priority. So if you're in a suffering state in any of these, it becomes a first priority. And in financial well-being, it could be going bankrupt or just not having enough money to make ends meet on a daily basis. And so you're constantly under a high stress situation. And in community well-being, it could be fear for your own safety. We know that those 5 elements accumulate to affect, outcomes like whether people are thriving in their overall lives, like new incidents of depression and anxiety. Generally, and there might be experts out there on this topic, and I don't claim to be an expert on mental health. I just know from our research that these elements predict other indicators of mental health. And one of them is that when people are thriving in these different elements I just mentioned, their chances of reporting new incidents of depression or anxiety drop significantly, and they're cumulative in that sense. And so that's kind of how I think about the answer to that. I think we just need to put it right on our slide where we show the 5 elements and put mental health in there because it's in there. And it's of course a hot topic right now, a really important hot topic right now in workplaces all over the place, and that organizations are trying to figure out how to deal with increases in stress and worry. We're seeing global increases that they didn't just start with COVID. The trends were going up before COVID hit.
Yeah, and that's something that we don't remind ourselves is we're there's sometimes this assumption that all of this social loneliness, some of our career engagement issues, those in particular, they're not new. They were just exacerbated by COVID. And in fact, something I don't rarely do, I'm going to share my screen here. You talk about this U.S. employee engagement needs to rebound in 2023. And you've got right here is the trends of the annual averages from 2000 to 2002. Jim, talk about, where this engagement piece is. I mean, this was right at the height of the pandemic, which was one of our highest engagement trends. Mm-hmm. What have we seen since, and why is it going in the trending down perspective, or what do you think is the situation here?
Yeah, and just as a side note, this particular trend and looking at it inside organizations in the way we define it, I think is essential and foundational to getting well-being right. Because if you don't take care of people's basic needs at work in terms of them doing their work, they're not going to have enough trust to really buy into what you're trying to get done from a well-being standpoint. So this is foundational to getting well-being right. And we've seen with this trend declining, we've also seen some big declines in people saying that whether or not their organization cares about their overall well-being. That's been dropping as well. But that peak at 2020 is symbolic of something we saw in that cares about my well-being item also, where it was sort of a rebound effect. We went through COVID real quickly, and let me rephrase that, a rallying effect where organizations responded right away, got people what they needed, were sensitive to people's needs early on, and then that sort of dissipated over time. People are trying to figure out when they're going to come into the office, when they aren't. All that kind of confusion has led to, and lack of stability in terms of culture and coordination about how things are being done, and having ongoing conversations and putting a cadence in place so people can kind of know what to expect. The drops occurred. I don't know how many people are familiar with the 12 elements we measure that go into this, but some of the real basic ones dropped and still haven't rebounded in the population at large. We'll be updating the global results here in June. We're just compiling those right now, but this is a U.S. trend. The troubling thing is you got both a drop in the percent who are engaged and an increase in the percent who are actively disengaged, and that's reached now a 7-year low. And so that's that in terms of the percent engaged. So that's a problem. That some of the drops have occurred in clarity of expectations, people feeling clear on what they're expected to do in their work, feeling connected to the mission or purpose of the organization. So there's been a growing disconnect between employees and employers. Part of that is, I mean, you can't decouple where people are working from any of this. I think it all has to be considered in the mix here. But no matter where people are working, it doesn't mean they can't be engaged if we do the right things. Opportunities to learn and grow have dropped. Historically, young people have reported higher levels of development than older people, and that's dropped for younger people. When I say younger people, I'm talking about people under the age of 35. So you're talking about the younger, the Gen Zers and the younger millennials, feeling cared about, feeling like they have a chance to do what they do best. And so if you kind of keep peeling it back and looking at, what some of the causes and solutions are, one of them has a lot to do with managers being equipped with the right tools and skills to have ongoing conversations with the people that they work with on a regular basis. And Chuck, I would argue that from everything we've looked at in our data, that if a manager has at least one meaningful conversation every week with each employee, they've gone a long ways. And so we had to do some research to figure out what's behind a meaningful conversation. And there are things like, when you ask people what went into that conversation when it was meaningful, recognition was important. My manager discussed my goals with me. That relates to clarity of expectations. We discussed how collaboration works on our team effectively. We discussed, how customers' needs are being met. Some pretty tangible work-related things. We discussed the work-life situation that they're going through. So the manager's in touch with everybody's individual work-life situation. And there's so much that goes into both engagement and well-being that's situational. And managers are in the only place to really get to know each person's situation. That's why the leveraging managers and upskilling them appropriately is so important right now, and it'll be so important going forward in getting this right. And I know it can be better because we study organizations and reward them every year for reaching excellence, and they're more than double that 32%. They're averaging about 70% engaged employees, and they're doing that by paying attention to a lot of things I just mentioned. And it does start with leadership. Go ahead, Chuck.
No, I'm just saying that's amazing statistic.
Yeah, they've 70% plus, and this is a really high bar metric. It's high bar because we designed it to relate to performance. So you can reliably know if you have a highly engaged culture, you're going to have lower turnover rates. You're going to have higher profitability if you're a for-profit organization. You're going to have customers who are much more pleased. And you've all probably seen the national statistics. Customer satisfaction's on the decline. And if you ask employees, they'll tend to tell you right now that they feel less responsible for the quality of service customers receive. That's really troubling. And it relates back to that disconnect employees are having now, almost like gig workers being separated from their employer. And it relates to the trend everybody's been talking about around quiet quitting. And so it's a problem that I think is a really serious one right now, but one that can be fixed and resolved if we put the right systems in place. And some organizations are.
Yeah. And that really goes to, this other, coordinating hybrid work schedules, 5 important findings. Something you and I were talking about right before we joined this group together. And it is, I come from an HR background, and all I could think about is that unbelievable capabilities of trying to make sure everybody is scheduled in and scheduled out. And we saw Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, basically send a memo out to the Starbucks folks and say, guys, we need you back in the office at least sometime. It's a great way to connect to people. It's a great way to collaborate with everybody, but it's also a great way to show our retail workers that we are right there with you and that we're coming in and doing it as well. And what I really liked about his whole picture is like, look, if you're within X miles or X kilometers of a Starbucks or, a place, they weren't asking somebody that, lived maybe in Arizona to try to fly up to Oregon or Seattle. But it was that whole picture. But you bring up these great hybrid work schedules and these findings that you've really kind of built out. And I'm going to go back to this number of days worked on site. talk about this and what you're seeing from a data perspective of how this is going right now, and where do you think the trends are going?
Yeah, we've been tracking these kinds of things quarterly. So about 15,000 surveys every quarter in the U.S., and we're looking to expand it in other countries as well. In fact, our global poll will be asking people, where they're currently working, and we'll be reporting some of those findings as well. But I think what Howard Schultz said is really important in the way that he said it, in that it wasn't, when it starts to sound like a mandate, people reject that because employees, particularly those in remote ready jobs, have experienced some autonomy, and there's been an endowment effect associated with that. And when you give someone something and try to take it away, when they've found some different ways of working and some freedom they didn't have before, they'll push back. But what we're seeing in the data, we looked at both. We asked people what their current schedule was. These are among remote ready employees, and in the green there you can see how many days people are working on site, and then in the blue that's their preference. So there is a bit of a disconnect between preference and reality. And when you see a difference between preference and reality, you tend to see higher levels of disengagement or lower levels of engagement associated with that. So how do you get, how do you manage that effectively? One is leaders do need to explain why, what the benefits are of people being on site, because if you leave it up to people making their own decision, by the way, the most frequent reason people say for how they decide is I just decide myself. The second highest is a leader or manager told them what to do. The least likely reason people give us for deciding how many days they'll be in the office is, and it's only like 14% of people say this, I decided with my team. What's important about being in the office? Well, probably to have some collaboration with your team and start building a culture with your team and figure out when are the right times to be together so that you can collaborate and build some sense of culture and innovate. And many people have to experience that to remind themselves of what happens spontaneously in a work environment. I've taken notice of that myself, just what happens that wouldn't have happened if we're all sitting at home and doing these periodic Zoom calls. They're very different things that happen in person. And I think employees can start acknowledging that once they experience it. When we studied, what leads to highest levels of engagement, it really does depend on the level of collaboration and how much synchronous versus asynchronous work goes on among teams. So some teams have learned they can get a lot of work done independently, but it's still important for them to bring it together periodically with their team and discuss it. Others are really reliant on one another in person, to have handoffs and to really work together in person. For the people that have really high synchronous collaboration needs, engagement peaked at about 3 days in the office. And for those who are more independent collaborators, about 2 days. So you think about that 2 to 3 day range is kind of a sweet spot if you're trying to maximize it through just showing up, right? And we know there's a lot of research about in-person time and how much that matters. We did our own big study on social time even before the pandemic hit, and we found that in-person time does matter the most from a mood perspective, but the total amount of time mattered less than the fact that it actually happens. So you just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We don't know what optimum in-person time is because it probably varies by person, but actually having it, I think, builds some trust. It matters a lot. You can think about, showing up for holidays with your family. Showing up is a lot more important than not showing up, and more important than probably the total amount of time as well. So it probably depends on families and that sort of thing. But same thing with work. We're human beings. There's a lot of studies around the value of in-person time that we can't replicate through Zoom meetings. Some people can continue to work effectively 100% remote. They build up some trust relationships. It's the only way that they can because of like you said, Chuck, the distance that they have. But we've been putting a lot of time into studying this. Just one other thing related to an earlier point. The quality of conversations that managers have with employees is 4 times more important than the number of days people are in the office. Just keep that in the back of your mind as well. Having those
Wow.
meaningful conversations. It's almost the case with almost any policy you think about. It's easy for us to go to policy. Well, we got to be in the office 4 days, or got to be in the office 3 days. Making sure you have meaningful conversations and really knowing what a meaningful conversation is. And we'd argue it ought to be strengths-based, it ought to be based on goals, ought to be based on recognizing people, all the things I listed off earlier. But the quality of the conversations people have on a continuous basis is important. And the conversation doesn't have to be long if it's regular, if there's a cadence. If it's every week, 15 to 30 minutes. Sometimes it needs to be longer than that, but 15 to 30 minutes. If it's not every week, then it's got to be longer to make up for lost time, right? So the cadence to that's important.
And again, just looking at the statistics, looking at the research, looking at the findings and understanding that, but looking at it also then from that well-being perspective, we can, again, I'm going to kind of make a little bit of a joke here, but we can have 77 ping pong tables for 50 people and call it well-being, or we can actually have a 15-minute meaningful conversation with each and every one of our staffers, and we know that we can get rid of the 77 ping pong tables. Correct?
Yeah, the ping pong tables might be fine, but don't expect those to replace the other thing.
Exactly.
So it might build some socialization, but any kind of policy or perk. We spent some time kind of writing about this in that well-being at work book, but any policy or perk that we've been able to identify, I'm not going to say any of them are bad, but if you lead with policies and perks and don't lead with culture, you're really missing out.
Yep.
And people are going to leave the policies and perks. The type of culture that's being put in place will trump those kinds of things by multiples when you look at the data.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to bring the third note up here, and I'm going to say, and again, Jim and I were having a conversation earlier today. I'm learning 2 new words, and these are words that are going to be in a future book. So you guys are all getting an early look at a book that what Jim maybe is coming out in May, correct?
Yeah, we've got a book. It's going to be titled Culture Shock in May. It's written now. It's just going through editing and the final stages of it. And we'll be like this article. We'll be putting out some excerpts from it, both on Gallup.com and other venues as well. This is the first one that we put out, and Chuck seems to find it interesting.
Well, I again, we were just talking about it earlier. So talk about what's the difference between a splitter and a blender. I'm going to have people have to go read it. I'm not going to show them anything else here. Yeah.
So we started thinking about how people segment when we've been in this hybrid kind of world for a lot of people. We've looked at this relative to on-site as well, but, we started thinking a lot about how do you segment different people so you get some insights about them so you know how to manage them better from a distance. And people tend to fall into one of 2 camps when you ask them about their preference. So the way we worded it, we asked in your best life imaginable, would you rather have work that is blended with the rest of your life throughout the day, or one where you have where your work and life are separated, basically, and more like a 9-to-5 job where work and life are completely separated? And as it turns out, in the general population, it's a 50-50 split between splitters and blenders. 50% want a blended work life, and 50% want it split up so they can separate out work from the rest of their life. And I imagine that changes a little bit by life stage that people are in. I know being a blender certainly helped me when we had young kids. It helped me when I was doing college and work at the same time. And so I've always kind of been a blender because I just kind of learned how to do that. But the other thing that's interesting is that you've got a lot of splitters and blenders, a really high percentage, no matter how you break down the data by age groups. You look at the youngest Gen Zers, they're almost 50-50 splitters and blenders. It's not one or the other. You get a few more splitters in the baby boomer generation, but there's still a lot of blenders in the baby boomer generation. I'm the very last year of, I'm 1964, the last year of the of the baby boomers, but I'm, like I said, more of a blender. And even if you look at people who are, have on-site jobs versus remote jobs, there's a lot of people, a high percentage of people that are one or the other. And so a point here is, and this is a simple low-hanging fruit. If we as managers don't ask people what their preferences are, we could easily disrespect them, and treat them in a way that isn't their preference. And once we know that about them, we know what to do on a weekend. If we have a question, we might put something in the inbox and say, don't respond to this until Monday. Or, there's different ways of splitting work too. Some people might split it into different kind of segments than others. So just having that discussion with people is really important. It's kind of like the low-hanging fruit of just asking people how they like to be recognized. 10% of people are asked that. But it's such an insightful answer when you hear it, and it's these are the kinds of things that managers can do easily that will really build some continuity between them and the people that they work with. It'll relate to both engagement and well-being.
All right. So Abigail's got an interesting question, but I'm also going to add Mary's question into it. So there's two questions from two different folks here. And this is an opportunity, I think, for you, Jim. Is there a quiz that helps you determine which preference you have? And is there a correlation of splitters and blenders with introverts and extroverts?
We haven't yet looked at the. We've got it. We're adding. Well, the first question: how do we measure it? If you go down a little bit further in the article, you'll see the actual wording that we used on the question. If you just kind of scroll down a little bit.
See, I was going to make them have to go to it, Jim, but here we
I'm
go.
Sorry.
I'm just joking with you. I'm actually just having trouble with getting my.
That's okay. We're
going to get it there.
We used one question. It's up a little bit further than that.
A little further.
I think it's right at the beginning of the article. Yeah, here it is.
Oh, is your best.
In your best life imaginable, would you prefer a job that is 9 to 5, where work and life are separated, or one where work and life are more blended throughout the day? We like to get it down to the simplest possible measurement that accounts for the most information that we can. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put this. We've got a panel of people who've gone through our strengths instrument, or Clifton Strengths instrument, which some of you are probably familiar with, and we're going to look at it by different personality types or strengths types to get some of those answers. So we're still digging into this. We're also, on our next survey, we're asking people about their current life situation and whether it is consistent with what their preference is. Then we'll look at well-being by, whether their current life matches that or not. I think, Chuck, you said that in some ways you'd like to be a splitter, but the way you work is more of a blending type of job. So you've been able to make that work. But I think some people are more extreme too on whether they're a splitter or not. So there's probably that going on.
Yeah, I jokingly said to Jim that I think I'm a wannabe splitter, but I work better as a blender. And, sometimes it's just Saturdays are Saturdays, and sometimes Saturdays are time for Chuck. And that's definitely something that we have to do. Hey, another great question. And by the way, hey, Bruce, good to see you. Are blenders less likely to retire? And if so, does a blended style support longevity? I thought that was a very interesting way to look at things.
Yeah, it is. We don't know yet in terms of retirement. We do have in our the panel we're currently working with, or people who currently have jobs, so they're not retired yet. But if we look at it by age group, we don't know the answer to whether they're more likely to retire, but we do know that splitters are a little bit more likely in that baby boomer generation. So that's a really good question. We'll have to follow up with that and see if we can figure that out.
What does the big brain of Jim Harter think it's going to be?
Well, I think that a blender is going to be more likely to be one of those people who, quote unquote, retires, but gets another side gig along with it. And we found that those people, like we're studying gig workers, we found the older gig workers were the ones that had the highest levels of well-being. Probably they did it by choice, and they found something that they enjoyed doing that was a gig. And our need to do something, doesn't go away when we retire. So it's really important, I think, for people to plan for that. And it would make you more of a blender because you'd probably schedule that work around when you can go see the grandkids at their events and that sort of thing, or whatever other activities you have going on in your life.
Yep. I will tell you, Jim, there's gonna be a lot of people that are gonna give you a lot of questions about splitters and blenders. So I think you got something here, because I mean, my chat is blowing up, which is awesome.
Well, I want those, because that'll feed some future research. So keep sending them.
You got it. I'll make sure when we're done here, I'll send you the chat so you get all of them, because some of them have come into me directly without, as opposed to in the everyone group. So I'll make sure that we get them all in there.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to do it. Another interesting concept, and again, it kind of goes back to the well-being piece, hybrid work versus in-person work. What are you seeing with, and by the way, Teresa, I'm going to take your question just a little bit left, and I hope you're okay with this. What are you seeing with the well-being of individuals who have to go to work versus the individuals that have that flexibility to work? Like we were talking about earlier, don't think we're going to see a lot of surgeries being done in the spare basement of the doctor. We're definitely not going to have somebody, walk into my apartment and ask for a latte. By the way, you don't want me to make you a latte, but that's beside the point. So these retailers that have to be there, the folks in the hospitals, production line, again, I don't think we're going to be building Chevy trucks in anybody's yards anytime soon. What are we seeing from a well-being perspective of those folks versus folks that maybe have a little more flexibility? And is there an enviness? There's a jealousy of that?
So there's kind of two answers to that, from two different angles. One is, so right now, about 60% of people are on site. Might be higher than some people think. But there's only about 40 to 50% that truly have to be on site. That have on site jobs where they truly need to be there. The people that are in remote ready jobs that are on site 5 days a week have much lower levels of engagement. They're dropping more than any other group in engagement, probably because of what you're saying, that they see other colleagues who are in remote ready jobs that they know could be done remotely, that they had a chance to learn how it could be done remotely during COVID. And now they're being kind of mandated to come into the office when they rationally know, I don't have to be here every day to get my work done. So there's that group. But then you got the other group of people who that need to be on site to do their jobs. What we're seeing in organizations now is they're thinking very seriously about how they build in different types of flexibility for those jobs, because the need for flexibility and autonomy isn't different just because you happen to be on site. That's a basic human need. People learned a lot about that during COVID. So we did do, and this will be a part of this upcoming book as well, as we did some research and writing on site jobs and what organizations are thinking about and doing, and how that relates to different levels of well-being and engagement. And the most popular thing that people are doing is dress code, but that's not the thing that really relates to higher levels of engagement and well-being. We asked a number of things, like PTO was one that mattered, so people have some flexibility when they can take some time off. So some increases there. A really hot topic right now, and there's some advocacy groups doing some research around this, around the 4-day work week. Everybody's heard about that, questioned by the press about all the time. We've done some research. It was one that came up as relating to higher levels of well-being. It doesn't guarantee that you're going to have higher levels of engagement, because engagement relies on that relationship between you and your manager and those conversations that you have and how you work with your colleagues. So the number of days is another policy that isn't going to replace, how engaged someone is, but it can relate to higher levels of thriving. And I've seen situations where it works. Will it work across the board as a mandate? I doubt that it could work across the board, but in some situations, I think it can be effective in giving some people some autonomy and some choice. And I've got just an anecdote. I've got a brother-in-law that runs a manufacturing plant in North Carolina, and this is well before the pandemic hit. They decided as a team that they were going to start doing a 4-day work week. They got their customers involved, and they agreed to it. They save on overhead. He said it's the best thing they've ever done. Again, I don't think it's going to work for everybody, but for them, they don't have to turn on their machines as often. They get as much work done. Their model, they're doing 4 10-hour days. Some people are proposing that in terms of just shrinking the number of hours down to 32. So there's both of those kinds of things going on right now, and there's some research being done on them. But that is one that kind of came up as, and it's an example. I wouldn't think about it as the answers per se, but it's an example of how if you listen to the employees and you think about what makes them have a sense of autonomy and flexibility, even if they're on-site workers, there are some options there in terms of things that organizations can do. If you just think about the outcome is give them more choice. There's other kinds of things that we learned about around giving them some choice on which shifts they work and trading shifts with their colleagues, and flexibility around scheduling and that sort of thing. So I think we just have to be creative about it and know that basic human need is still there, whether they're required to be on site or not.
And Jim, and by the way, Brian Colcher, good to see you. I'm going to take your question and make it a little bit more of a hybrid question. When we think about trying to improve the work environment, getting people more engaged, and really understanding about the work itself, what are you seeing great organizations that are doing it well and right? What are you seeing them do differently that maybe organizations that are still trying to remain in a status quo or are not really functioning to the optimal level that they could? What are you seeing as those top traits, those top factors that cause them to really create that higher engagement philosophy?
Yeah, one is they're really clear on what they want their culture to be, and culture involves, not making mandates about where people are working, but explaining why. So, what kind of culture do we want from a leadership standpoint? Being really clear on what kind of culture do we want going forward and why. You've got to explain why. You've got to give people the reasons that you want the type of culture that you want. Do you want a culture of high well-being? Do you want a culture of high flexibility? Most people want a culture where customers are engaged and they're meeting their customer needs. So that's got to be in there too. You got to your reasoning has to be centered on not only the employee's well-being, but also how work gets done. Because people rationally know I'm coming to work to get some stuff done, right? That's why I'm hired. Individual productivity, how well we collaborate with our colleagues, and how we meet customer needs are really important reasons. Another reason for building the right kind of culture is that it builds resiliency. You can attract the top stars if you have a real culture, and you can be resilient during tough times if you have the right kind of culture. So that's one thing, is that they've thought really carefully about what kind of culture they aspire to have and why, and then they communicate that widely and get their managers involved, upskill their managers to have the right kind of conversations with people. 70% of the variance in team engagement relates back to the manager. And so managers have never been more important than ever before. So they take upskilling managers very seriously. I mentioned communication. Then there's also an element around accountability, that they hold managers accountable for engaging their workforce and in performance management. And they simplify performance management in a way that doesn't feel like it's a separate thing from engagement, and well-being can be blended in there as well. But they teach managers science-based principles about how to manage effectively, give them the tools to do it, give them the practice, it's not an event. It's got to be a process where they get a chance to practice having the right kind of conversations, and then meet with their peers and talk through what their learnings have been. So it's, teaching fundamentals, but then building on top of those fundamentals with practice, so the light bulbs start going off. Another one, Chuck, that's been very, very effective is putting the element of strengths inside of all of it, because it shortens the distance between people. If I've got a language that I can understand that explains how I think and how you think, and how the rest of our team thinks, especially when we're in remote settings and separated, we can come together much more quickly, and we can anticipate what one person's going to do in response to something that I do. And it's been an accelerator for engagement and well-being. It also helps us understand how people develop a thriving life very differently. Somebody who's a developer might save money because they want to give those savings to somebody else or to a special cause. Somebody who's competitive might want to save their money so they can see how much, how they compete with other people on it. So they might take more of a competitive angle. Neither one of those are wrong. They're both right depending on the person's individual strengths. That strengths element feeds into all of it and makes it all just much more efficient, especially when we're at a distance.
Yeah, and activator is pretty much at the very top, and just about everything else is down here. So I totally understand what you're saying, because with my team, it's always like, get to the point and tell us how we're going to activate things, how we're going to move things forward, how we're going to get things going, because that's where my blood starts to get excited and move forward. But I also have to make sure that we're taking care of our woos and our other aspects of those strengths. And I totally understand that. And sometimes it's hard, especially for an activator, because we're going right into it and we're ready to go. And got to remind myself to bring everybody along with me. So that's kind of fun, and it really has helped. And if there's only a book about It's the Man, oh wait a minute, there is a book about It's the Manager, isn't there? So, by the way, one of my favorite books that I've read from Gallup, and I think I've read just about all of them. When you say upskill, Jim, and you kind of alluded to a lot of the skills that you're really talking about the managers needing, but if you'd have to pick, like, say, one or two very specific type of trainings to send a manager to, outside of how to be, how to do the job, what would you say would be the one or two types of trainings that you would recommend sending a manager through?
Well, we put it under the concept of moving from more of a boss or traditional manager as delegator role to coaching. And so you want to have training that teaches them how to effectively coach people, because the new workforce, even before COVID hit, was asking for someone who coaches them based on their strengths. And when we study the data, studying engaged workers, we have them reconstruct their previous days. Engaged workers are doing what they do best at about 4 times the rate of those of the amount of time that they spend doing what they don't do best. So we need to help people get into situations, and managers need to be well equipped to help people get into situations where they do what they do best. By the way, since COVID hit, in a recent study just this year, we found that ratio went up to 5-to-1. So strengths is even more important than ever before. So I think the strengths component as a foundation is important for managers to learn, because it just makes their job more efficient. We have too many things coming at managers right now. They might have a wellness program over here. They might have performance management over here. They got employee engagement survey coming out over here. They've got all these different things coming at them. And the most important training, I think, is training that blends those together and makes their life easier, so they can see the connection between engaging someone and how I'm doing performance management. And strengths can be a real important tool to make that all much more efficient and individualized, because we all know when we deal with people that they're very different. Whether we talk about our own kids or whether we talk about our colleagues, we're all somewhat different. And if we can shorten that gap and make our jobs more efficient, but I'd lump it all under the concept of moving from boss to coach.
Yep, and it was funny because Jeannie asked almost that exact question. Is like, what are the trains? Do we coach to have a higher well-being? And the answer was yes. And I knew that was pretty much the answer you were probably going to head down, which is why I asked it the way you did. Jim, what would you say, as we're finishing up? This is going to be my last question to you, but it's really going to be more of an ability for you to kind of say, how do we get moving? How do we evolve? How is that activation period going, and where do we need to go post-COVID, new hybrid, splitter blender engagement kind of mindset? Where do you think the best organizations, the best communities, the best people, where do you anticipate they're going to be doing and what they're going to be talking about, say, 6 months from now and a year from now?
Well, I think the first thing is to accept that hybrid work is here to stay. And it's highly unlikely that that learning that we had during COVID is going to go away, and that people have figured out some new efficiencies in the ways that they work. There's going to be a group of people who think that they should just decide on their own. I think it's a manager's job to help them think about how it affects the whole organization in terms of what they do and when they show up and all that. And people do need to be nudged in many cases to get those realizations, to have those kinds of experiences. So I think the first thing is to accept that we're going to have some element of hybrid work that we're going to have to manage going forward. The second thing is that I think organizations all need to take seriously doing what we call a culture audit to really do some heavy qualitative work. Gallup does this kind of work with organizations a lot, where we really do kind of a diagnostic of where their culture currently is at, what they want their future culture to be, what their aspirations are, and then what are the barriers to them getting there and how they develop that. So I think taking a step back and thinking about what we want our culture to be and why, kind of what we were talking about earlier, and how that relates to meeting customer needs effectively. And that's going to vary a little bit for every organization in terms of how they can execute that, given the distribution of their workers and where they need to be located and all that. And I think that the other thing we kind of talked about that's going to be essential is upskilling managers. Getting managers to a point where their jobs are more efficient, easier from a distance than they've been in the recent past, and where they can, in particular, bring in those younger workers who are now more likely to feel separated from their employer. They need to see that they have opportunities to develop. They need to have managers who are deeply interested in what their futures are going to be, and to see what their opportunities are inside the organization. So that'll be important. And it goes without saying that I'm going to say that people need to have the right metrics in place so they know how they're doing. I think the metrics are important in that they don't tell you exactly what to do, but they tell you how far you've gone and where you can be in the future. So I think, and there's some new metrics that we're recommending now that are particularly aligned with the needs of the new workforce that I think people ought to be paying attention to.
I look forward to learning a lot more about those metrics and, how we can really kind of blend those into this whole picture of, creating an inclusive culture of well-being for all. Jim Harter, thank you so much for your time today. I'm very happy to have had this time with you and look forward to many more conversations.
Thanks for having me, Chuck. Great to be with everybody. I'll look forward to seeing all those questions.
Will do. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.